Hi everybody, Professor H here. In this video, we are going to take a look at Chapter 8, Part 3. We are in the Adolescence chapter, and we're going to look at emotional and social development in adolescence. Let's start our PowerPoint. Okay. Emotionality in adolescence, storm and stress. Basically, there has been an idea out there about the period of adolescence being an adolescence of storm and stress. According to some ancient philosophers, Aristotle and Rousseau, this idea has been supported. So your book has a quote from Aristotle talking about youth, saying that they are heated by nature as drunken men by wine. And the philosopher Rousseau, when relating to youth, said, as the roaring of the waves precedes the tempest, so the murmur of rising passions announces the tumultuous change. So interestingly, this idea of emotionality and that adolescence is a period of great diversity in your emotional range at that point in time has been supported back through ancient times. In German literature, there is something called Strum and Strang, and these are stories of teens and early 20s, and basically that translates to being storm and stress, where we kind of get the heading for this part of the chapter in the book. And these stories are based on people in their early 20s or late teens, early 20s, and they are full of angst, sadness, and romantic passion, because these are the emotions that are thought to be very stormy within this period of adolescence. The idea that people in adolescence are experiencing a lot more emotionality and that their emotions are more volatile, meaning that, you know, there's more ups and downs and fluctuations between the ups and downs and the emotions, has been supported using the experience sampling method, the ESM method. We talked about that in a previous video. That is where somebody wears a watch-like device, and at certain times they are a buzzer or a beep goes off, and the person wearing the watch has to rate on a scale of like 1 to 10 of how they are feeling at that time. And there's a range of questions that they go through and they answer on that Likert scale. We talked about that in a previous video. I just wanted to give you a quick recap on that. What was found in this study is that people in adolescence are more self-conscious, they are easily embarrassed, they are more moody and lonely and nervous than previous points in their development. A source of distress is a combination of cognitive and environmental factors. So that is their own thoughts going on in their head that makes these things occur, as well as certain environmental factors. For example, being in high school during your adolescent period. There is, however, a decline in the average emotional state with age. In the beginning of adolescence, you see these great fluctuations. However, towards the end of adolescence, the moods are starting to stabilize and you do not have as much emotional volatility. Self-understanding and self-concept in adolescence. In adolescence, their self-conceptions become more complex. In other words, as the child has developed, they have developed a greater sense of self with each stage that they've been going through. By the time they reach adolescence, there are several different self-concepts that are viewed. The first one would be the actual self. The actual self would be a true self-conception, the idea of who you really are. And that is like a realistic view of who you are. Whereas like a kindergartner thinks they're the best in the world at something, they don't have like a true self-conception. As people come into adolescence, they are starting to develop that true self-conception. There is the possible self. The possible self is what you could be, what you would like to be, what you could become. And there are, you know, different possible selves that a person can think of themselves as being. There's the ideal self. This is the self that you would be the utmost, your gold standard of who you want to be. That would be your ideal self. And your feared self. The feared self is what it is possible to become, but you fear becoming. So this is the possible self that's on the negative side. So for example, everybody says, oh, you look like your great Uncle Joe. Well, great Uncle Joe happened to be an alcoholic, a drug addict, and at work, there's a lot of stuff going on with Uncle Joe, and that's your feared self. You don't want to become Uncle Joe. That's a feared self right there. So self-esteem has a great deal to do with these selves, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to self-esteem. I wish I had a whiteboard because I'd like to draw all sorts of stuff up here, and I'm not advanced enough on these videos to do that yet. There's also the false self, which is what's shown to others. Now, each of us, when we go out into the world, depending on where we are, we may put on a bit of a false self. Like if I'm going into work, I may have different views than maybe people at work and different ideals. Well, I'm going to just put on a kind of my false self. I'm not going to maybe lie to them or anything, but I'm going to act a little bit differently than I would maybe act at home. And each of us has our false self that we, it's that face that we put on when we go see the relatives that we don't want to see. When we do certain things like that, that's when we use our false self. And we all continue to have these different senses of self as we go through development throughout our lifespan. Now, as I said, self-esteem is related to those senses of self. If you have your ideal self here and your actual self here, and they are very far apart, you imagine a Venn diagram where you have two circles that are not touching. That would be having low self-esteem because your ideal self is very far from your actual self. Once those circles overlap a bit to where you have your ideal self and your actual self overlapping, at that point, self-esteem goes up because you are closer to that ideal self. And that is one of the ways where self-esteem and your ideals and your sense of self kind of interact. There are more complicated interactions that you can have, but we're not going to go into those at this level. Self-esteem has a tendency to fluctuate during adolescence. It's kind of up and down. Our self-esteem has gone from being very high in early childhood to dropping down to its lowest point when we're in adolescence. Susan Harder had this concept called the domains of adolescent self-concept. So it's kind of like the idea of having all of these different selves. You have different concepts, self-concepts of yourself in different settings. And as an adolescent, you can more accurately view these concepts. You have the scholastic competence, which would be how you're doing in school. Social acceptance, how is your social life? How do you get along with others? Where's your acceptance on the social ladders out there? Athletic competence, obviously that's, how athletic you are. Physical appearance, which is a big one with self-esteem in kids and adolescents. Job competence, romantic appeal, behavioral conduct, and close friendships. All of these things have to do with adolescent self-concepts, and you can have kind of high esteem in one area, low esteem in another, feel good about yourself in scholastic competence, but maybe bad about yourself with athletic competence. I mean, there are different ways that can go. Oh, oops, okay, global self-esteem. I wasn't gonna leave this chart in, but I did. So this is how self-esteem fluctuates. As I said earlier, in childhood, here we're looking at 9 to 10-year-olds have very high self-esteem. As we come into adolescence, it drops very low. 14, 15, 16-year-olds have very low self-esteem comparatively, and then it starts to creep back up in your early 20s. And that's the average way that this works. And there is a difference between males and females. Males have a tendency to have higher self-esteem than females. The total is somewhere in the middle. And you can see there seems to be a dramatic difference between males and females in self-esteem during these time periods, with males having overall better self-esteem. All right, we've talked a little bit about gender development throughout our lectures. And in adolescence, it's an important time in gender socialization. So basically, during this period of time, Often adolescents feel more intensity regarding their gender development. And we're not going to go into a lot right now about gender identities and all of that. And I wish I had time to do that. I might do a supplemental video if I have time to do that. But research has been shown to support the idea that, gender identification is intensified during this time. From 6th to 8th grade, boys and girls' self-descriptions became more gender stereotyped. And throughout adolescence, this type of socialization has continued and increased. In traditional cultures, and there's a difference between traditional cultures and Western cultures. So in traditional cultures, this type of intensification of gender differences or intensification of the gender roles and that sort of thing is very high in traditional cultures. Boys are expected to achieve their manhood by providing, protecting, and procreating. Those are the main goals of this is how you become a man in this society. And of course, adolescence is that transitional period. And in girls, womanhood is inevitable because of biological markers. So in women, once again, in females, there is the starting of menstruation that marks their movement into adulthood. With boys, it is often some type of ceremony that has to do with age or where they are during that period of time, but there is no specific event like there is with girls. Okay, this is a slide that shows protect, provide, procreate. Learning to provide for a family economically is a traditional part of the male gender role. Here, an Egyptian father and son fish together on the Nile River. In a lot of traditional cultures, the males and females go right from basically childhood into that adult role. There is not this area of emerging adulthood. So basically this adolescent period is just that preparation to move into adulthood, learning what their roles will be within their traditional culture. The cognitive developmental theory of moral reasoning. Kohlberg has a universal theory of moral development. We're actually going to talk about that more, I believe, in our emerging adulthood chapter. We're not going to get too much into it right now. The focus on the structure of moral reasoning. There are 3 levels, and each one of these levels has subcategories to it, but we're not going to go into detail here. The pre-conventional level is usually for younger people, the likelihood of rewards and punishments. So what decisions you make, the moral judgments that you make are based on what can I get from this or how will I be punished if I do this. The conventional stage of moral development, according to Kohlberg, is a value conforming to moral others. In other words, this is like, well, it's against the law, so we can't do it. It is a, this is the rules, we can't break the rules. This is the societal norms, we can't go against those. And that's kind of the conventional reasoning. And then the next level is the post-conventional. And the post-conventional moral reasoning is not all people reach that level according to this theory. And it is basically an objective principle of right or wrong. So in this particular stage, and like I said, we were going to look at this more in emerging adulthood in our next chapter. We're going to talk more about it. This is where the idea might be where, oh, this may be against the law, but this law needs to be broken because of a particular reason that outweighs a human need that outweighs the actual law. And so our teens are most likely in this conventional period of development with the moral reasoning. So that's where we're looking at for our adolescence, basically, in that conventional values, the conventional moral reasoning. Wow, that was tough. Okay, got it out. All right. There's another view of moral, There's another view of moral reasoning that talks about this different kind of approach to moral reasoning. And that is a cultural developmental approach, which provides a basis for 3 types of ethics. So that's the ethic of autonomy, like how does this affect me personally? How does this decision that I'm going to make, this moral decision, affect me personally? How am I going to benefit from this? There's the ethic of community. How will my judgment and what I do in this moral dilemma affect my community? And the ethic of community means that you're putting that community first, really above your own. And then the ethic of divinity, where what value judgment do I make here? How do I address this moral problem based on a religious belief? So that's the ethic of divinity. So these are other ways that people look at these moral reasoning and how to make decisions based on morality. And our adolescents are starting to use all of these as well, these different ways at solving moral problems. All right, let's take a look at religious beliefs, and we're going to talk more about this in emerging adulthood as well. Sorry about the coughing. I've been sick for like a week, so trying to get over that. In developed countries, they tend to be highly secular. Americans are more religious than others. A lot of other countries in Europe and different Western type of countries are not as religious as the United States. Differences in religiosity include family characteristics and ethnicity. So even within the United States, when we're just looking at United States, there are certain families that, you know, kept within the family certain religious beliefs that have been carried on and kept structured. And there are certain ethnicities which are higher in their religious beliefs than other groups. Religious involvement provides protective factors. Something that we do know is that oftentimes people in general who have religious beliefs and kind of believe that they're not alone in dealing with problems and that there might be some help for them from a spiritual belief or entity, that can be a protective factor when it comes to dealing with stress and dealing with depression and some other things like that. So we do know that having religiosity provides some protective factors. And oftentimes our adolescents are kind of questioning the beliefs that they have been raised with, kind of taking a new idea, a new look at these things. And they can often start kind of developing their own ideas here. And we're going to look at more of that in emerging adulthood. So interestingly, when you ask Americans what's going to happen to them when they die, a lot of them will just say, oh, I'll go to heaven. Even if they've already told you that they don't believe in God, a lot of people will answer with that type of question, with that kind of response. This chart talks about beliefs and behaviors and the percentages, and this is, of course, among adolescents in the United States. So 84% believe in God or a universal spirit of some sort, some overarching spirit. 65% say they pray at least once a week. 63% believe in the existence of angels. 52% attend religious services at least twice a month. 51% say that religion is important in daily life, and 38% are involved in a church youth group. So these are a much higher percentage than you would see in other more secular countries like in Europe, some other places. And these are from like 2016. So I don't know how this has shifted over the last few years. So it would be really interesting to take a look at this concept, like trying to see how religiosity in adolescence has changed over these last few years, and especially after 2020. It'll be very interesting to see how things change after 2020. All right. In adolescence, there's initially an increase of conflicts with parents. Adolescents are becoming their own person. They are having their own thoughts. They're starting to question beliefs that their parents have, kind of come up with their own beliefs. They are reaching sexual maturity. They're not always great at their cognitively working through things, but they have normally greater independence and autonomy at this point. So basically, parents have a tendency to still want to monitor their adolescent and make sure they're safe and making good decisions, but the adolescent oftentimes is just butting heads with them on everything. This starts early in adolescence and it continues through adolescence, but towards the end of adolescence, these type of conflicts with parents reduce because agreements oftentimes are kind of made. I got a truce going on usually by the end of adolescence. So and that has to do also with the adolescent being able to think through things a little better and some cognitive development as well. So as we see from this graph, this is parental conflict in adolescence. Not much going on in early childhood, not much conflict. Still in, right before puberty hits, there's very little conflict with parents. And then as soon as puberty starts hitting, it starts elevating. You start having more and more and more parental conflict. And then around 17 or 18 years, that's when it starts to really drop off in most cases. Okay, siblings and extended family relations. So sibling relationships often lead to conflict, as we've seen previously, but less than in earlier childhood periods. In middle childhood, we saw that there was a lot of childhood conflict between siblings, early childhood, tons of conflict between siblings, but in adolescence, those conflicts are starting to become less. And by the end of adolescence, those conflicts are significantly reduced. In traditional cultures, relationships between siblings can be a little bit different than here in Western countries. Siblings have childcare responsibilities. Oftentimes they're responsible for caring for younger children. They are close to extended family members because in traditional cultures, families often live in groups. There's more contact in traditional cultures than in Western countries with extended family, just because of what I just said. They're oftentimes grandpas and grandmas and aunts and uncles and everybody are living very close together in a close community and depending on one another. Okay, friends provide companionship and intimacy during adolescence, and intimacy becomes more important. That intimacy means that friend that you can trust and that you can count on, and that trust is very important in adolescence. In traditional cultures, adolescents spend more time with family than with peers. However, when it comes to traditional cultures, boys tend to have more free time and they can actually hang out with friends much more frequently than females can in traditional cultures. The importance of intimacy. So once again, as I mentioned on the last slide, intimacy is very important in the adolescent relationship. And this intimacy, once again, is not always, I'm not talking about romance, I'm talking about that closeness to a friend. Girls have a tendency to have more intimate friendships than boys. Girls tend to talk a lot more, and boys have a tendency to just more hang out and do activities more. So there's a big difference between boys and girls and the amount of intimacy or how many intimate relationships that they have. This brings us to cliques and crowds. Adolescents have a tendency to group together, and they are grouped together based on social things and interests. So there are different types of groups and cliques. So cliques are a small group of friends. That would be like 5 or 6 friends, 4 to 6 friends, that type of group of friends that have something in common. And crowds are a larger group that is based on reputation. It may not necessarily be friends. So the jocks, for example, if there might be a small clique within the within the crowd of jocks. Say the small clique of maybe some girl volleyball players that are good friends, but they're not friends with all the girl volleyball players, but they are part of that crowd of girl volleyball players. Crowds help adolescents define their own identities. It comes in different groups. For example, these different crowds can be like elites, the rich kids, we have the athletes, we have the nerds and the academics, we have the deviants, we have our punk kids, we have our emo kids, our, all these different groups. And I don't know what the kids do as much these days, but that's kind of the definition of the crowds, is the overarching, bigger type of group, and the clique is the smaller type of group, which is the close friends that are within a particular group. This is just a picture of some South African kids enjoying a game of soccer. And this is demonstrating a clique. This is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's like 8 kids, but these are close friends that are hanging out together. All right, this brings us to bullying in adolescence. Adolescence is a very, there's a high incident of bullying in adolescence. Bullying is composed of 3 different components: aggression, which can be physical or verbal; repetition, that means a pattern over time. So that means not just one time a mean thing being said to you, but having it repeated over and over, or even physical abuse. And then a power imbalance. So somebody who has more power will be physically or verbally aggressive towards somebody with less power, and have a pattern of this over time. So that's the 3 components that we're talking about. There are negative effects of bullying, including helplessness, anxiety, and happiness. It can decrease school performance. And in adolescence, there's a really high rate of cyberbullying. Because a lot of times these adolescents are on the computer and media a lot more than other younger children, and they have more freedom in this as well. They're on social media, and nobody is looking over their shoulder, seeing what's being posted. So this cyberbullying is something that is hard to see. Oftentimes kids who are being cyberbullied are not easily identifiable. Because they don't always talk about it. Sometimes they're embarrassed about it and they don't come forward about it. So it is definitely a problem in adolescence. Falling in love. Romantic relationships increase over time, and throughout adolescence, these romantic relationships increase and become more intense. Asian cultures have a tendency to have these types of relationships later than American kids. And romance is prevalent across cultures. Okay, so romantic love as a basis for marriage is a fairly new idea. So basically what I'm saying here is, in Western cultures, the idea of marriage for love has been around for a while, okay? However, worldwide, that has not been the case. Worldwide, marriage has been something that is used as a tool for social mobility, for bringing income to the family, for ending conflict between groups. There's a lot of different reasons why young people would be married to one another, but love was not the key factor for most of history and most of cultures. So basically, this romantic idea of romantic love is a relatively new idea. Okay, cultural variation in adolescent sexuality. So sexuality is viewed differently in whatever culture you're in. There are permissive cultures that tolerate sexuality. There are semi-restrictive cultures that have some prohibitions, and there are restricted cultures that have strong prohibitions. Let me see what my next slide is. Okay, so basically, a permissive culture would be, for example, somewhere like in the Scandinavian countries. In the Scandinavian countries, it is thought that, well, kids are going to have sex. That's just the way it is. Young people in adolescence, that's when hormones are going crazy, they're going to have sex. It's not uncommon for somebody in a Scandinavian culture to let their teen have their girlfriend or boyfriend spend the night over. They're very open about safe sex. They're open about, birth control, all of that. And what we're going to see later is their pregnancy rates are way lower than ours. So it is a permissive type of culture that says, you know what, premarital sex is fine. Just be safe. We know you're going to do it. You're going to be in a safe environment, and we're going to be open to this idea. Let's go next to restrictive cultures. Restrictive cultures would have strong prohibitions on premarital sex. These strong prohibitions apply more to females than they do males. So the idea of marrying a virgin in a lot of traditional cultures is very important. However, if a man goes out and has sex with somebody, that doesn't seem to be any type of problem. But if the female were to have sex prior to marriage, that would be a problem. It would be a shaming for the family. It's a reason to put women to death within some cultures. So a restrictive culture would have strong prohibitions on adolescent sexuality. And then there's like the United States. The United States is what you would call a semi-restrictive culture. So we have our ideas about sexuality with adolescents run from permissive to restrictive. So we have kind of the whole range within the United States, which can send a very mixed message to our youth. And we'll come back to that. And that, okay, this just leads us into our pregnancy rates and contraceptive use. So pregnancy rates and contraceptive use varies by country, by the type of country. So it's influenced by the availability and attitudes about safe sex and contraception. So your lower rates are going to be in the permissive and the restrictive countries. So the permissive ones are going to be very open about contraceptive use and talk about pregnancy, talk about prevention, all that kind of stuff. And then the restrictive cultures are just going to say abstinence, and there's severe punishment if you are not abstinent. So those two types of views towards adolescent sex are, they have lower pregnancy rates. In the United States, sorry, I get distracted a little bit. United States have a high rate, very high rate of pregnancy compared to other countries. This is because our country sends very mixed messages about adolescent sex. If we take a look at this graph, this is a graph that talks about teen pregnancies. So these are teen pregnancy rates in developed countries. So our rates of birth per 1,000 girls aged 15 to 19. So basically, United States, you can see, is top of the class here. We have the highest rates, and we are a culture that has that mixed message sent to our kids. If we want to look at who's lowest on the list, we have the Netherlands and Sweden. These are those countries that I was saying have those open policies where they understand that teenage sex is a thing that can happen, and they want to be safe, and they want to, but they have some different outlooks that we'll see also in emerging adulthood. But these are permissive cultures, the Netherlands and Sweden. So this is all out in the open, the sex, the having birth control, all of that kind of stuff, which results in these low rates. And then our United States with our mixed messages is got the highest rates of developed countries. All right, sexual orientation. Most become fully aware of sexual orientation in adolescence. So by adolescence, somebody pretty much knows what their sexual orientation is. About 2% of American adolescents identify as sexual minorities. That would be bisexual, homosexual, I don't know if like pansexual and some of these other things fall in there or not. Homophobia can make coming out traumatic. So, sorry, when somebody is deciding to come out as gay, as lesbian, as bisexual, something other than heterosexual, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. Parental rejection is a really big concern. There are a lot of people who are just not going to be accepting, depending on their culture, on their attitudes. They are just not going to be acceptive of this. And that person may be rejected or even kicked out of the house, sent out on their own due to that, exposing that they are not heterosexual. In addition, acceptance by peers can be something that is scary for people. When somebody comes out, some of their peers may be accepting and some may not. In general, acceptance of sexual orientation other than heterosexual is becoming more accepted, and with our youth, it is becoming increasingly accepted. However, it is a very difficult thing. That coming out process is a very individual thing, and it can be a very, very risky time for a person, whether it's in adolescence or even older. Okay, media content. dominant method involves digital devices. So adolescents these days in the United States have constant media content. They are constantly connected in developed countries. It says 92% of adolescents connect daily in developed countries. And actually the most prominent media that they use is music. So listening to music is a favorite activity. Crime peaks in adolescence. And interestingly, it's males in adolescence that have the highest crime rate. So it peaks at about 18 and then declines. So the tendency to get into trouble drops off after that. There's an age-crime relationship. In other words, that period right around 17, 18, right in there is where it peaks and then it drops off. There are two types of delinquency, life course and adolescent. So life course is basically a persistent delinquency. So this is where you started getting in trouble younger and you just keep getting in trouble and you keep doing stuff, keep stealing things, keep doing whatever type of crime you're doing, and it just continues. In adolescence, there may be a time where you just kind of are, they're feeling their oats, they do something dumb, maybe steal something from a store, maybe do some type of issue during adolescence, but then they don't do crime at all after that. There's a multi-systemic approach to delinquency. Oh, okay, we're not even going to go into that. So this is just a graph about the age and crime relationship. So this is the difference between 1842 and 2011. And if you notice here, something that I think is very interesting is regardless of all the progress that we've made since 1842, the graph of criminality, as you can see, is very similar. So we have like in this teenage period, it's peaking and then it's dropping off in the 20s. Same thing over here. Peaking in the 20s and then dropping off. So interestingly, it seems to be something that has persisted in the United States over time. This particular pattern related to age and criminality. Oh, okay, the multi-system, okay. So I wasn't going to go into this, but the multi-systemic approach, this is basically talking about the outcomes of programs that are designed to help with juvenile delinquency versus just arrest and placed in a juvenile system. So the numbers of arrests basically and the weeks of out-of-home placement. So out-of-home placement would be like the time spent in juvie versus home, and arrests are, well, how many arrests you have. So different programs, there have been programs put in place that help with re-educating the kid and dealing with some of the issues that are at the stem of the problem of why the delinquency is recurring. And the kids that went through this program, basically their arrests were a lot lower and their weeks of out-of-home placement were a lot lower. So in other words, there are things that work better than just popping somebody into the juvie system. There are approaches that deal with education, psychology, all of this different stuff that can help our youth to do better. Depression, risk, and treatment. This is kind of come down to our last topic here. One of the strongest risk factors of depression is being female. And I will say that, okay, between males and females, that's the highest risk factor because females tend to ruminate on things. In other words, they tend to replay things in their mind a lot more frequently than men do and males do. There are two types of treatments. Generally, there's antidepressant medications and psychotherapy. These things kind of go hand in hand. There's different types of psychotherapy. And we will talk a little bit more about this, and I'm going to go into more detail about this topic in our emerging adulthood chapter, which is going to be the next video. Okay, so hang on for that. All right, so this brings us to our end of this particular presentation, and I hope you find this useful. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. Bye-bye.